next, the next would be a professional, what one is that? Professional groups?
Organizations or individuals.
Oh, yes, professional groups, organizations, or individuals who would like to speak. And I have to present a bill in Environmental Quality Committee, so let me give the gavel to Assemblymember Jones.
Is there any public testimony regarding this part of the hearing? If the sergeants can assist the speakers. Welcome, and if you can state your name, tell us who you are and representing.
Ladies first.
Yes. Good morning, Francie Kaler. I'm past president and current legislative chair for the California Association of Licensed Investigators. Do you want me to go ahead and? Sure. Thank you. I just wanted to say that we certainly support the Bureau of Security Investigative Services. They provide a great service to ensure that private investigators, particularly as I am a private investigator, that they ensure that they follow the standards, they serve to protect the public, and they serve to protect the consumer. On issue number 4 specifically, which is what I'm interested in, regarding the firearms permits and the CCWs, we certainly support Mrs. Alarcon's representation of what the law is interpreted to mean. We would like to see in the Private Investigators Act specifically that is more specific, so there isn't any question, because over the years there has been many questions and much confusion. So we would just like it to be very clear, possibly in the Private Investigators Act specifically. It is clear in the Security Act, it is clear in the Private Patrol Officers part of the Act, but not in the Private Investigators section. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Rick Von Gelder, and I am a licensed California private investigator and have been so licensed for approximately 28 years and have worked in the field for just over 30 years. I've also served in various positions in California state associations representing the private investigative industry, and also served on the Bureau's advisory committee in 2010. I listened to some of the themes here, and as a field investigator, I think there's a lot of problems that are not being addressed, and there's an evolution going on technologically in the world. California, the Bureau has the ability to regulate within California, and it seems to me that the only ones that are being regulated are those that are following the rules. There's been essentially zero disciplinary actions against private investigators in the last 5 to 7 years, and I think technology is, sunsetting us out unless the Bureau can get together technology a little bit better and start updating the PI Act, which is it's antiquated in my opinion. I wanted to also discuss the fact that there's a PI fund that requires a 24-month reserve, and we reached that and exceeded that, and in 2010, $1.5 million of that reserve that I think could have been used to promote programs was transferred over to the general fund, which I think was a big mistake. I wanted to discuss legislative history for private investigators has been, I think, dismal from my point of view. I probably have people here that would disagree with me, but it's been somewhat dismal. Record keeping at the Bureau, when I was a ledge chair of a specific statewide association here, we ordered a disc of all the licensees' addresses to promote a mailer that was to present information on pending legislation. Of the close to 10,000 names that we received and sent out, approximately 3,000 were returned with improper addresses. And I presented that when I was serving as an advisory committee member. I presented that to the committee as a concern. I'm also concerned when our mandated identification cards that we have, misspell the name of the issuing agency of Consumer Affairs with putting an M in it. I think that's pretty sloppy. I wanted to say that efficiency, I haven't seen it in the 20 years that I've been following it. I'd like to see it. I've tried to be involved to promote the type of changes that would benefit the private investigator. This profession is changing, and our licensing and regulations are not changing anywhere near the same speed as we need to go. I've reviewed the strategic planning documents that have been presented, and they all seem to say the same thing with a few different, usages of words. Let's see here. There was, I think today the FBI is not going to law schools anymore. Primarily to find a lot of their agents. They're going to Silicon Valley. Technology's taking over. I wanted to quote an article that was in the Sacramento Bee last Thursday, why state computer projects fail, and quoting Alex Castro, which I think sort of signifies what I'm concerned with. And it's so they run into brick walls, bad leadership, bad tech people, lack of vision, overestimation of in-house skill sets, and then ram through a new IT system like that is going to fix everything. And then bureaucracy, whether public or private, doesn't work like a 12-step program. I'm Jane and I'm a weak leader. Won't get a sympathy, hi Jane, at the next IT managers meeting. It's time for some change, and I'd like to see it happen. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Any other public testimony? Come on up, sir.
Good morning. My name is Robert Hesse. I'm a licensed private investigator. My name's
There you go.
There we go. Good morning. My name's Robert Hesse. I'm a licensed private investigator. I'm also a DRC member for the BSIS. I'm a firearms instructor for BSIS and security guard, several licenses, and used to run a security company for a few years. One of the questions I think I can answer for all of you is when a guard is involved in a discharge or a shooting, when you were, Mr. Jones, you were asking about I'm also a retired law enforcement officer for about 30 years. When an officer's involved in a shooting and he's taken off and put on admin leave during the investigation, oftentimes the owner of that company will do a similar situation, either reassign or, if it's not a good situation, suspend on his own away from BSIS, where BSIS may not have the authority to do a suspension, the owner of the company will. So it falls on the employer most of the time, and the employer will take action on the employee, where BSIS doesn't have that authority.
Great, thank you. I think that Senator Hill is the one that
Oh, I
asked specifically
apologize.
about- and that's okay.
I was trying to keep up with all the questions.
I understand, no problem. All right.
Okay.
Thank you very much. That's
You're
helpful.
Good morning. Very briefly, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Frank Huntington. I'm a current private investigator in the state of California. I'm also honored to be chairman of the board of CALI, the California Association of Licensed Investigators, largest licensed investigator association in the world. I'm simply here to state that we support the Bureau and Ms. Alarcon by the association. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think regarding the issue with the CCWs and the licensed investigators, there might be legislation working its way through the Assembly right now on that issue. So before I take members' questions, I'd like to give Mrs. Alarcon an opportunity to respond if she cares to any of the comments from the public.
Thank you. Yes, I would. In regard to the comment about updating or having current addresses, we are dependent on the licensees providing us change of address informations, and oftentimes that just doesn't happen until it's time for license renewal, and because they don't get their renewal, reminder, then at that point in time they remember they never updated the information with the Bureau. So our address changes are current since I've come on board. We have developed an integrated licensing monitoring system to assist the licensing manager and the supervisor in monitoring all document processing, not just application. And so we are keeping abreast of the address changes upon receipt, and we are current. The issue is it's contingent upon the licensee providing us the information.
I think on that issue, if I may interrupt you, it's also important to keep in perspective 3,000 returned addresses out of 300,000 seems, like a.
Well, I think in that
number.
population it was 10,000 out of 3,000.
Oh, okay.
But again, we're finding a lot of times when we do send out information to particularly the companies, we're not having current address information. When I go out now and speak to the associations, I pretty much remind individuals one of the biggest things that's going to help you make sure that you get your timely renewal is to make sure that the Bureau has current address information on you. If we don't have it, we're not able to reach you. And that's also true of just the informational correspondence that we send out. For example, the recent changes in the law that happened in January. We sent out notifications. Many of them returned because the licensees have not provided us with current information. In regards to the identification card, that was an issue that was raised when I first came on board, and I have been working with the vendor, and I believe the changes have been complete. The issue just has to do with contractual and making sure that we had the ability to make that change. It wasn't that the Bureau and my predecessors were aware of it and chose to disregard it. There's just some procedural steps in dealing with the contractual arrangement, and I have updated it since my time on the Bureau.
On the subject of licensee communication, are you using an email database to
Thank
keep
you
in
for
constant
asking that
contact?
question. Yes, we do have an interested parties list. Anybody, we encourage, when I go out, we encourage people to sign up, but also we use snail mail for those who don't. For the real critical changes that we need to get out there, we will make sure that a letter is issued to the licensee. For general information of things that are happening at the Bureau or just updates, we use our informational list. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Member questions?
Yes, please,
Ms. Baker?
and thank you for your responses. Going to the issue of address changes, I'm curious if there are any requirements that when someone who has a license has to, within a certain number of days, affirmatively contact you and let them know where they're going. I'm thinking of other agencies and institutions in the state, like the California State Bar. If I'm an attorney and I move to another law firm or I change my status and become a government attorney as opposed to a private attorney, I think I have 30 days. And I have to let the bar know, or I'm subject to a penalty or some form of enforcement. Do you have anything like that?
Yes, we do have those current provisions in the law, and whenever we can, we do invoke it when we go out and do our compliance inspections. Particularly, we find the address of record when we go out there is not where the individual is located. Yes.
Okay. And did I hear you correctly that it was 3,000 out of 10,000? So about a third?
Well, I cannot attest to that because I wasn't there at the time. I was just reiterating what the gentleman had said. So I cannot validate that data. Mm-hmm. I can only say that since my time here, I have experienced return mail, but most of it has been it's been attributable to not having a current address for the licensee.
Mm-hmm. And to the question that the gentleman raised regarding the surplus and the funds going, I think $1.5 million going to general funds, how frequently do you have more than your reserves, and where do those funds typically go? Or do you know?
I would have to look into the fund. I mean, I've been here for 20 months.
Okay.
I don't recall ever exceeding the statutory limit since my time frame here,
Okay.
and the funds are used. We're pretty much using the funds the way the records are showing. We have like a 6-month reserve at a given time,
Mm-hmm.
but not anything exorbitant. I would be happy to validate that information and get back with you.
Thank you.
Any other member? No member discussion? Mr. Kadani, did you have anything?
Mr. Chairman, no. If it pleases the committee, I'll remain here for my second bureau chief, if that's okay.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Ms. Alarcon. So the next item is number 2, is a joint oversight hearing for the Cemetery and Funeral Bureau. Welcome this morning, and if you can state your name and where you're from for the benefit of the committee, I'd appreciate it.
Good morning. My name is Lisa Moore, and I am the Chief of the Cemetery and Funeral Bureau. I have been Chief for 3 years, and I have worked at the Bureau for a total of 15 years. I want to thank the Senate Committee on Business, Professions, and Economic Development and the Assembly Committee on Business and Professions for this opportunity to represent the Cemetery and Funeral Bureau in the Sunset Review process today and to respond to several issues and recommendations that have been offered by committee staff. I have prepared an overview of our organization and its current activities and would like to first begin with a brief review of the Bureau's history and functions. The California State Board of Funeral Directors and Embalmers was established in 1939, and the California State Cemetery Board was created in 1949. In the mid-1990s, both boards were transferred to the Department of Consumer Affairs. Shortly thereafter, a policy chief position was established, and the resources of both independent boards were consolidated. In 1999, Senate Bill 1306 reorganized the boards as bureaus to be managed by the Department of Consumer Affairs. In 2000, the Bureau as we know it today was created. The Bureau licenses, regulates, and investigates complaints against 13 different licensing categories in California, totaling more than 11,000 licensees. This includes funeral establishments, funeral directors, embalmers, apprentice embalmers, cemetery brokers, including branch locations and licenses issued in order for a broker to work at more than one location, cemetery salespersons, cremated remains disposers, crematories, crematory managers, cemetery managers, and private non-religious cemeteries established after September 1939 that collect endowment care funds. There are approximately 250,000 deaths in California every year, and nearly each one will require one or more of the Bureau's licensees to be involved. The Bureau regulates almost every aspect of the licensed cemetery and funeral industries and has responsibility for oversight of both the fiduciary and the operational activities of the industries. With regard to the fiduciary responsibilities, the Bureau oversees pre-need funeral trust funds, cemetery endowment care trust funds, and cemetery special care trust funds, totaling nearly $2 billion. To carry out its duties and protect consumers, the Bureau currently has 21.5 authorized positions consisting of 9 full-time field staff located throughout the state and 13 staff in Sacramento. Although the Bureau operates as a single regulatory bureau, there are still 2 funds for the Bureau, the Cemetery Fund and the Funeral Directors and Embalmers Fund. The Bureau has statutory authority to enforce the licensing and practice acts in the Business and Professions Code relating to the funeral, cemetery, and crematory industries. The Bureau also has jurisdiction over specified sections of the Health and Safety Code dealing with human remains, cemetery, and crematory provisions. The Cemetery and Funeral Bureau established an advisory committee and utilizes it as a forum where both consumers and licensees can provide input on funeral and cemetery-related issues. This process allows the Bureau to meet its regulatory obligations in an open and transparent environment. The composition of the advisory committee consists of 7 members who serve a 2-year term with the possibility of an extension for an additional 2-year term. 4 members are selected from the industry, and 3 members represent the public. The Bureau Chief selects and appoints the members upon approval from the Director of the Department of Consumer Affairs. The members, who volunteer on their own time and at their own expense, serve in an advisory capacity only, making non-binding recommendations directly to the Bureau Chief. Since the last Sunset Review in 2002, there have been a number of changes in Bureau leadership, with multiple changes to the Bureau Chief and Supervising Auditor positions. Also, since the last review, the Bureau has moved its office location from 400 R Street in Sacramento to its current location in Natomas. We have had many accomplishments since our last Sunset Review in 2002. Some of these accomplishments include enacting consumer protection regulations that require funeral establishments to disclose to the responsible party any pre-need funeral arrangement they have on file for the decedent, implementing the requirements for annual inspections of licensed cemeteries and crematories, beginning a comprehensive review of the cemetery and funeral regulations to identify necessary changes to streamline our enforcement processes and enhance consumer protection, appointing a new 7-member advisory committee, revising, developing, and updating various consumer publications related to funeral and cemetery arrangements, and establishing probation monitoring guidelines and procedures to ensure that licensees who are placed on probation comply with the terms and conditions of their probation, including cost recovery, and reorganizing and revising the Bureau's website to make it easier to navigate and provide information in a user-friendly format, creating an outreach video message with tips and information on end-of-life decisions, which is intended to go live within the next few weeks, and finally, developing a 2015 through 2018 strategic plan. We appreciate the opportunity to work with the legislature, the administration, and our stakeholders to continue reviewing the regulatory effectiveness of our program and consumer protection services we provide. There are always improvements to be made, and we strive to identify those areas that need attention and can be enhanced to protect consumers and streamline our regulatory program. I will discuss some of those areas a little later in my testimony. The committees also requested, as part of this overview, that I provide a description of and update on the litigation in which the Bureau has been involved over the past 4 years. The California Funeral Directors Association created the Funeral Directors Service Corporation, an Oregon-based for-profit corporation created to develop and administer the California Master Trust Program. That program administers pre-need contracts that individual funeral businesses enter into with customers. Pre-need contracts are purchased by consumers to make their funeral arrangements with a specific funeral home in advance of need. These funeral establishments then contract with the professional trustee, which makes it easier for the funeral establishments because the trustee manages the funds paid toward pre-need contracts. On April 18, 2011, the Department and the Bureau filed a civil suit against the Funeral Directors Service Corporation and others over alleged illegal activities uncovered, in part, by an audit and subsequent investigation of the California Master Trust by the Bureau and the California Attorney General's Office. Although the Bureau has settled with all of the defendants named in the action, this case remains open pending the selection of a successor trustee and the dismissal of the case. Settlement included approximately $2.1 million in restitution, and some of those funds will be used for damages suffered by consumers, consumer protection enforcement efforts, and to reimburse the Bureau's enforcement costs and attorney fees associated with the lawsuit. The committees have identified 13 issues in the background paper and have asked me to address several of those issues during my testimony today. Specifically, the committees have asked me to address the long-term fund condition, general price list and cemetery enforcement issues, and potential industry changes. Issue number 1 from the background paper asks how the Bureau administers its 2 funds and asks the Bureau to highlight any deficiencies or desire to raise fees. Finally, issue number 1 asks if the Bureau has considered merging the 2 funds. The Bureau currently operates with 2 separate special funds, 2 separate practice acts, and 2 sets of regulations. In managing the separate funds, the Bureau allocates the appropriate costs to the applicable funds. Personal services costs are charged to each fund based on position allocation, and operating expenses and equipment charges are allocated based upon which program function incurred the cost. When the expense is applicable to both funeral and cemetery activities, it is split between the 2 funds. Occasionally, there is unavoidable overlap in program activities for most of the Bureau's functions. For example, the Bureau's field staff consists of 4 positions that are identified as funeral and 5 positions that are identified as cemetery. In an effort to be efficient, consistent, minimize travel costs, and meet inspection mandates, all field staff are trained in both cemetery and funeral inspections and investigations and perform those duties for both cemetery and funeral licensees when needed. The same overlap occurs with our licensing and audit functions as well. The Bureau is funded by 2 special funds that provide revenue to maintain both of the Bureau's programs. At the end of this current fiscal year, we anticipate approximately 11.8 months in reserve in the Cemetery Fund and an approximate 4-month reserve in the State Funeral Directors and Embalmers Fund. We have expended a large amount of the Funeral Fund on the California Master Trust litigation, but anticipate recovering some of those costs from the restitution. Additionally, the Bureau is evaluating its current fee structure and exploring ways to realize operational efficiencies. Furthermore, the Bureau is supportive of merging both funds as well as the practice acts. Issue number 3 from the background paper asks the Bureau to explain how it verifies compliance with the posting requirements of Senate Bill 658 and asks the Bureau to explain the enforcement process for those entities which are not currently complying. Business and Professions Code Section 7685 requires funeral establishments who maintain a website to post specific information on their homepage about the goods and services they offer or their actual general price list. To verify compliance with this requirement, the Bureau includes this as part of its inspection protocol, and field staff review any applicable website for compliance prior to the inspection of each funeral establishment. Any deficiencies are cited as a violation on the inspection report and discussed with the licensee at the conclusion of the inspection. Additionally, the Bureau investigates all complaints alleging noncompliance with this section. A comprehensive review of all the inspection and investigation reports are conducted by either an enforcement analyst or supervisor who conduct another search of the website for verification of compliance. For violations of the Bureau's laws or regulations, the Bureau can issue a letter to the licensee warning them about violations and the expectation of compliance, or, when appropriate, issue an administrative citation with the assessment of a fine. Repeated offenses of the same violation or egregious violations can result in subsequent citations with increased fines or even formal administrative disciplinary action, such as probation or revocation of a license. Issue number 5 from the background paper asks the Bureau to explain the enforcement process for licensed cemeteries and to explain the process for revoking a cemetery license and what happens to that property after a license is revoked. The Bureau is also asked to explain what maintenance standards are and to explain endowment care and any need to revise endowment care requirements. Cemeteries are subject to warning letters, administrative citations, and formal disciplinary action, just like any other licensee. The Bureau is mandated to conduct at least one unannounced inspection of each cemetery every year and investigates complaints against cemeteries in response to consumer complaints. The unique set of circumstances surrounding cemetery operations are unlike most other business entities in the state of California. While the license is issued to the cemetery corporation to conduct business, the real property in which the cemetery, mausoleum, or columbarium is located is private property. When a cemetery license is revoked, it prohibits the owner from selling any interment space, vaults, markers, monuments, or conducting any other activity related to sales in the cemetery. The law does, however, allow the Bureau to approve interments in the cemetery for decedents who have a prepaid contract for an interment space in that cemetery. The Bureau does not take control of the property. Because the cemetery is a private business, the landowner may still be subject and responsible for compliance with any local ordinances or laws. Cemetery maintenance standards were developed to help ensure that cemetery property is kept in a condition to prevent the cemetery's offensive deterioration. Under current law, cemeteries must have minimum standards for cemetery maintenance. For example, cemeteries are required to keep cemetery roads seasonally accessible, repair any surface which may present a hazard, keep all occupied crypts and niches properly sealed or closed, and repair any grave marker, monument, or burial vault that is damaged by the negligence of the cemetery or any of its employees or contractors. Endowment care for cemeteries consists of a trust fund, referred to as the Endowment Care Fund, which is made up of contributions collected when interment property is sold. The fee amounts are specified in the Health and Safety Code and must be collected at the completion of the initial sale of the interment property. Only the income generated from the Endowment Care Fund can be used to provide regular care and maintenance of the cemetery. While the amount of Endowment Care Fund that must be collected for each interment sale was increased in 2008, the Bureau agrees with the committee's recommendation to conduct a study on Endowment Care Fund requirements and needs. In recognition of this need, the Bureau will place on the agenda of the next advisory committee meeting this topic for discussion and consideration. Issue number 10 from the background paper asks the Bureau to explain any preparations for changes in the funeral industry and how or if the Bureau will need to expand its regulatory processes as industry changes occur. The Bureau keeps abreast of industry changes and trends through a variety of sources. The Bureau's advisory committee is comprised of both industry members and public members, with meetings held at least twice a year. These meetings are a public forum and are regularly attended by industry associations, consumer protection organizations, and members of the public. This is a valuable resource that allows the Bureau to obtain input on emerging issues in the profession as well as any concerns from the public. In addition, the Bureau's field representatives conduct inspections in assigned geographic regions of the state and have contact with licensees on a regular and ongoing basis, which provides an opportunity for direct communication with licensees and a first-hand look at what may be new or upcoming changes in the industry. 7 of the Bureau's 9 field staff previously worked as licensees in the industry and are knowledgeable about the profession and what may be evolving in the future. Furthermore, California has 2 colleges with a mortuary science program and staff who regularly communicate with the Bureau on a variety of topics related to the industry. California law currently allows 2 forms of legal disposition of human remains: burial or cremation. Any alternate forms of disposition, such as alkaline hydrolysis, would require a statutory change to make it a legal form of disposition and an option for consumers. Discussions surrounding end-of-life decisions are uncomfortable for many people. The Bureau continues to be available to discuss any changes or trends that might impact consumer choices when making end-of-life arrangements for themselves or their loved ones, and will evaluate any necessary regulatory changes with consumer protection in mind. The Bureau is also making great strides in its efforts towards consumer protection and to be an effective, efficient, and transparent part of state government. The Bureau is preparing a written document for submission to the committees that will provide a comprehensive response to all 13 issues and recommendations identified by the committee in the background paper. Thank you again for allowing me to be here today, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you so much. We appreciate you being here. We're on, right? Any questions from committee members? Yes, Mr. Wood.
Yes, I have a few questions. First of all, you mentioned obviously that cemeteries are private property, and there are endowment funds. And what happens if the landowner goes bankrupt? What happens to the land? What happens if they go out of business? What if they have no heirs? What happens to that land?
Well, the land is. There have been several times when the land has been, for tax reasons, has gone up for auction. Once there's no longer a license there, we lose our jurisdiction. When the license is revoked, it's like I said, it stops them from doing anything there, but they still have an obligation to maintain the property.
Okay.
It's a double-edged sword when it comes to cemeteries, because it's not like any other business in California where you can lock the door and remove the equipment and have it end. You can take the license away, the landowner can walk away, and you still have a piece of property with human remains that are buried there. It is an area that the Bureau it's come up more than once, and we need to continue to look into it to say what happens when this happens, when we don't have jurisdiction other than to allow an interment there if somebody has a pre-need. But it's still a business in a sense that it doesn't come to an end.
And so in the past, how has that been dealt with when someone has simply walked away and left their responsibilities? What has happened in the past in those cases?
Usually the license is canceled. We try to work with those folks. We've had people say, literally say, I'm going to hand you the keys because I want to walk away. And we'd say, we're not in the business of running a cemetery. That is not something that we do. That's why I explained that we don't take control of that property.
Well, if you no longer have jurisdiction and the property owner has walked away or the land is back, who has jurisdiction at that point?
I don't have an answer for that. I would have to go. I would say who has jurisdiction. As long as that person is the property owner, they still have a responsibility to maintain it. Now, if they walk away, I don't know how that's going to be enforced if they no longer have a license through us and there's no the jurisdiction, say at the local level, there's nothing there.
So what's happened in the past, I guess? Because you said this has happened before. So how have those been resolved?
Sometimes they're either sold. Somebody will come in. Like we've had one that's, for instance, through disciplinary action, it's remained unlicensed for a period of time, and then somebody will come purchase that cemetery. So we've had that happen. We've had non-religious organizations come take them. Religious organizations come take them over. It makes them exempt from our licensure. So there are times when they are resurrected.
Okay. And then I have a couple of other questions. I'm looking through your license holders, And if I missed this earlier, I apologize.
I'm sorry.
I'm looking through the license holders, the sheet on license holders, and I notice I'm curious. You have active, and then you have different categories. You have active, out of state, out of country, and delinquent. So I'm looking at, like, for example, embalmers. You have 348 embalmers who are delinquent in their license, and you have 1,645 active. So I'm looking at, of the total number of embalmers out there, 20% are delinquent. So how are those dealt with? Because that number seems to be fairly constant over the last 4 years. So what happens to these delinquent embalmers?
We usually address that through, or it can be addressed through our inspection program. When we go inspect, we look at their licenses. And as if they happen to have, when there is a fine assessed based on, we issue citation, there's a fine assessed, it puts their license on hold. So sometimes, and they can't renew their license until they pay that fine. So sometimes they'll wait until it gets to be renewed. And then pay the fine and renew their license at the same time. And as cremation is on the rise, there are fewer embalmers.
So who's responsible? I mean, so you have an embalmer that's working for a funeral home, I guess. I guess that's how it works. I'm not
yes.
Obviously not an expert in funeral homes, but so if a funeral home director has an unlicensed or a delinquent embalmer, is that person subject to fine?
Yes. The funeral establishment can be cited, the funeral director, the managing funeral director can be cited, and the embalmer can be cited.
And none of the. I guess in my profession, you can lose your license. So are there times when you go for a certain time when your license is delinquent, you lose it. You lose your ability to practice your craft. Does that happen much with embalmers and funeral directors?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay.
They have up to 5 years to renew their license before they can't renew it ever again from the time it expires. I mean, they have to renew annually, but in order to say you can't even pay the accrued renewal fees and renew it again, they have a 5-year window of time.
That's a pretty generous time frame. I mean, when you look at other license categories, it seems like just to me, and I'm new here, so apologize for that. But
that's okay.
Looking also at I'm also looking at cemetery managers. When you get to you go fiscal year 2010, 10, 11 through 12, 13, that number is relatively constant, 67, 73, 70, and then boom, 2013, 14, you have 169. Is that a typo, or is that a real number?
I can't answer that. I'd be happy to follow up. It sounds like it could be a typo, but I'd have to go look and see what happened there.
Because that would essentially make 40% of your cemetery managers delinquent if that's truly the case. So I wonder if that's a reporting, if that's a typo. I would guess it might be a typo, but it's a big change when you go from 70 to 169 in one fiscal year. So
no, I would agree, and I'd be happy to follow up on that.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions, but I would like to just follow up on Mr. Wood's question, talking about the issue of when you're in an extreme enforcement situation and what your process is. And I think there's two things: process and communication. And who, and I'm referring to the Evergreen Cemetery situation. Right. Who do you communicate with? Is there a plan in place? It's happened in the past. It's probably going to happen again. Do you have a formal process? It seemed like maybe that's an area that we could work on filling that in and improving that. And also the area of direct communication. Who do you feel an obligation to proactively communicate with?
Well, we try to communicate with anybody who has questions of us. There are parts let me back up for a minute. When we have an investigation against a cemetery or any licensee, if you will, we maintain the confidentiality of that investigation until and if it goes to the Attorney General's office and we file an action. And there are certain times during that process that information is public. And then as it moves through the process, there are certain times when that information, certain parts of the information become public as we move through that process of when the hearing is and once a decision is final. So I think we have the enforcement process down? Are you asking, like,
Well,
who
I
would we
think-
put that information out to?
Right. I will. Let me be clear. And I think what would be a great idea and an addition would be to proactively communicate with the local elected representatives and the state representatives from that area. Essentially, we're talking about a state licensing issue, and when you have an assemblyman, a senator, it would be really good to proactively reach out to them about an issue in their district so that they can be involved. This is their constituency, and I think that would be something, as you look at developing a more formal process, that I would really like to see in writing as part of your plan.